All right, let's talk about, should you draft a running back in the first round? It's kind of an age-old question at this point, but, I wanted to kind of give both sides the best argument as possible and then ultimately give my opinion at the end of this video. So this isn't going to be strictly a running back value conversation. It's going to be hard to talk about this conversation without talking about that, but ultimately, I kind of want to talk about hit rates with running backs in general. How often do they end up being good or even great running backs? And, is it worth it to draft one in the first round? Because an argument you often hear when there's a running back who is going to be drafted in the first round, people will say, well, if they end up being Christian McCaffrey or Derrick Henry, isn't that worth it, right? That's an argument you often hear. So first we have to ask ourselves, well, how often does that happen? What does the average first-round running back turn into? So since the turn of the century in the year 2000, there have been 50 running backs who were selected with the first round pick. Exactly 50. 14 of them were what I consider to be total bust, never really amounting to much of anything. That's 28%. 21 were what I consider to be good, but nothing special, as in, maybe you were even like a Pro Bowler once or twice, but we're probably never an All-Pro, probably were never a top 5 running back, but a good player, right? That's where you would fall into. That is the most common thing to happen out of a first-round draft pick running back this century. 4 were great, but with an asterisk. The asterisk could be Marshawn Lynch, who was great, but with a different team. So I didn't feel like it was fully fair to just put him in the elite category because that's kind of a different thing. It could be simply Bijan Robinson, who has been great, but his career still has some time left. Or it could be Todd Gurley, who was great, but just didn't play that long. So, 4 I put in that own category, and then 10 were just straight up elite. They were great. They were great right away for their team, and they played for a long enough time that they were what you want when you draft a running back in the first round. So that's kind of your hit rate. You could argue 20 to 28% are going to be what you're hoping for when you draft a running back in the first round. Now, that's first round, but obviously drafting a guy at pick 32 is different than drafting a guy at pick 2. So, I wanted to kind of look at simply the top guys who were drafted simply in the top 10 in this time period. And if you do that, the numbers do go up, which is expected, but that's still good to know. Only 2 I threw in the total bust category, so that's just 12.5%. Also, 2 were in the great but with an asterisk category. I had 6 in the good but nothing special category, and 6 in the elite category. So that's tied for the most for a category. So you could argue that drafting a running back in top 10, okay, listen, this is far from a guarantee, but this does tend to have a pretty good hit rate. Now, keep in mind, only 16 were drafted in top 10 in 25 years at this point. So bit of a, doesn't happen too often. But when it does happen, they have a pretty good hit rate here. And then finally, I wanted to just go from 2010 on, because again, the football in the year 2000 is wildly different than football in the year 2025. So while I wanted to use that to get a bigger sample size, I wanted to try to purposely shrink the sample size. And you do see it does go down here. In the 20 first rounders that were selected since 2010, 6 were total bust, 7 were good but nothing special, 4 were great but with an asterisk, and then 3 were in the elite tier. Also, I'm going to do some editing in real time here. I actually messed up on one of my earlier charts. I said that there were 4 that were in the great but with an asterisk tier when I did my entire, all the 50 running backs from since 2000. It's actually 5. I was 1 off there. That's why it was only 49 on the list. My bad there. That's why I show my notes, because I make mistakes and sometimes I correct myself later. Sometimes I forget, and you have to help me in the comments. But okay, that was a little mistake there. It doesn't change much of anything, but just wanted to mention it. So for this, it does go down, right? It is less likely for a running back to be elite now than it has been in previous years, which I don't know what that means or why that's the case, or if it means anything. It is a small sample size, so maybe it's just a smaller sample size issue. But yeah, that's fascinating. I also should mention that I did want to look at the top 10 picks from just this era on. There's only 7 though, so that's like such a small sample size at this point that I just feel like it's not really worth mentioning. If there was some trend, like if they were all elite or if none of them were, I would bring it up, but it doesn't seem to be the case. I was also curious to see how often does it happen for a running back to get drafted and then end up having success with the team that drafted them, like as in like postseason success or even winning Super Bowls? Because ultimately that is the goal, right? When you draft Patrick Mahomes, your goal is that he's going to lead you to Super Bowls, and that's kind of the situation with every player, right? So that was a question I had, is how often when you draft a running back do they end up being a contributor in the Super Bowl? And it happens relatively frequently, but it's very rare for it to be like, I think, a notable player taking you to a Super Bowl. Like Clyde Edwards-Helaire won a Super Bowl with the Chiefs, but he wasn't really much of a player. Sony Michel did have an impact in that Super Bowl run, but ultimately, I think most people felt like he was just kind of the running back who was getting the carries behind a good offensive line. And once, a couple years later, they moved off of him, right? So there were some instances like that. You also had Reggie Bush in 2006. He was drafted, and then in 2009, he did win a Super Bowl with the Saints, but he also was getting like 6 carries a game. So it wasn't like he was like the main reason. Rashard Mendenhall did win a Super Bowl with the Steelers, but that was before he was really getting significant playing time. You did have Joseph Adai in 2006, who had 1,000 yards that year and won a Super Bowl. So that's when you look at it and say, okay, he was a contributor, like that counts. But really, the main player, I would say, to win a Super Bowl and be like a real contributor, like really moving the needle for the Super Bowl winning team, was Jamal Lewis with the Ravens, who was, he was a great player, was named to the All-Decade team in the 2000s. Helps when you're drafted in 2000, but still, while he's not a Hall of Famer, he was a really good player, had over 1,300 yards in 2000 when they won a Super Bowl. That's kind of the one you look at and say, okay, yeah, that was a real contributor, but that was also 25 years ago. But ultimately, that can get a little bit fluky as well. While, yes, that's the goal, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't build a Super Bowl contending roster with spending a top 10 pick on a running back who helps you win the Super Bowl. And, of course, if you're picking top 10, running backs have short shelf lives. It's hard to rebuild that quickly. There's a lot more that goes into it than just that. So, yeah. One other thing I wanted to do in this video, because I'm bringing up all these numbers, but they don't really mean a ton when I can't compare them to other positions, right? So I found this chart courtesy of a USA Today article, which is simply just using all-pro selections and saying when you are drafted by certain positions, how often do they end up being an all-pro, which is a way that we can kind of compare these positions. And you see, interestingly enough, running backs are actually the most common position to end up being an all-pro if they are drafted, which sounds surprising, but it actually totally makes sense once you start thinking about it, because running backs can have 1 or even 2 all-pros. There's a flex there, so sometimes you have 2 all-pros that are running backs. And if you're less likely, these are just first-round picks, so if you're less likely to be drafted in the first round, that kind of makes your odds of being of having a higher hit rate go up. Like, for example, there are years where only 1 running back is taken, which means that theoretically 100% of the running backs taken in the first round could be all-pros. Whereas if it's a tackle, even though there's 2 all-pro spots, if there's 7 tackles that are taken, then the highest they could get is 2 out of 7, right? That being said, it doesn't fully work that way for all of them, and running backs is still at the top of the list. You see, the bottom of the list are the positions that we kind of know are hard to draft in the first round: quarterback, tight end, and wide receiver. So, looking through this, like, when you draft a running back in the first round, do you often get a good player? Like, yeah, it is more frequent. Although ultimately, I think we also still have to look at this and mention that it is not a lock by any means that if you draft a running back, you're going to get Christian McCaffrey. There are just as many Leonard Fournettes out there who, hey, he won a Super Bowl, but, as more of a role player with his second team. So maybe not the best example to use, but you get the idea. When you draft a running back in the first round and with a top 10 pick, there is no guarantee they end up being a superstar, but there is maybe a higher likelihood than a different position, and that essentially is the question. If you buy into the fact that running backs are not as valuable as other positions, which I know not everyone does, but if you buy into that fact and you agree that running backs are less valuable than other positions, I think it creates a really interesting dilemma of, would you rather take a bit of a safer bet at getting a good player, but it also means that there is a smaller likelihood that you are going to get a great player at as an important position as, say, offensive linemen. Because, the question that I kind of said earlier of if you get a Christian McCaffrey or a Derrick Henry with pick number 10, well, isn't that worth it? Nobody says that about other positions, right? Nobody says, well, if you draft a tackle at 10, if he ends up being Tristan Wirfs, is that worth it? Because everyone agrees, like, yeah, that's worth it. But with the slightly higher likelihood that the running back will actually become a good player or even a great one, that's where things get a little bit, I think, interesting to me. So while I still think that for me personally, I wouldn't feel great about drafting a running back just because I do view the position as significantly less important than other positions. I think there is a scenario where it could make sense, especially later on in the first round. If you're the team that's trying to be competitive right now, I've never actually been someone who said that you should never draft running backs in the first round. I think there's very specific situations. I think the Lions you could look at as a perfect situation to do that. They're trying to be competitive. They needed a running back, going out and getting Jahmyr Gibbs. Again, some people would say you should never do that, but if you're going to do it, that's kind of the situation to do it, in my opinion. There are a couple other things I didn't really mention, like obviously the shorter shelf life for running backs has to matter, so that's another negative, not just the positional value. And the other factor is that when you draft a running back with a top 10 pick, they usually become one of the highest paid running backs in football. Top 10 picks are worth like over $4 million. Najee Harris, who was a pretty good running back, was considered a top running back on the board, got a $5 million deal. So you don't usually get much more than that. So that's another factor. So ultimately, in conclusion, every time you draft a running back, there still is a risk factor. They still could stink. You still could get a Trent Richardson situation. And if you think a guy is going to end up being Derrick Henry, it's probably not going to happen. It's probably going to be, less likely that you get maybe the best running back to ever live, right? But even if you think you're going to get an elite running back, the odds are usually against you of that happening. But there still is a higher chance of you getting an elite player that way than with a different way. The question is just, are you willing to, again, it's all a math problem almost, of are you willing to take a slightly higher chance trying to get an elite player at a more valuable position that will last longer, or would you rather take the lower chance that you'll, or take the, maybe the thing with the lowest upside, but that has a higher chance of hitting that upside? It's two lottery tickets. One is worth $1 million. One is worth $10 million. But the one with $1 million has a higher chance of hitting it. Which one would you rather have? Well, I think arguments can be made on either side. But those are kind of my thoughts on all of this. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Always love hearing from you. And of course, as always, thanks for watching.